start at F. Okay, welcome everybody. It is, my calendar says it's November 16th, 2023. What an honor. We have Secretary David Kramer. I'm going to call you Secretary because you were an assistant secretary. An amazing
But David will
individual.
also do so.
Okay, so everybody got it? This is Secretary Kramer. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He's going to tell us about that bureau. I do a little bit of part-time work in that bureau right now myself. He was there in 2008 to 2009. He was president of Freedom House, which should be of great interest to everybody on this call. It's very hard to create a totally objective scientific standard for the level for freedom and democracy, but Freedom House, I would say, is the leading organization that we look to for guidance on that. He's currently the director of the George W. Bush Institute in Florida. He's going to explain that too. Very quickly, why am I wearing a hat? The doctor saw a little thing on the forehead that he wanted to remove, and I assure you that nothing bad, but it's also something you don't want to look at right at the moment. It's going to be fine, everybody. And then very briefly, on final projects, I want the secretary to know that the students in this process have all choices before them. They can come and observe all the time. They can observe some of the time. They can do some of our quick weekly assignments, some not. They're absolutely welcome to come at any level they want. Those few who have chosen to, shall we say, compete or to go for a certificate, a commendation, I'm asking them to do a final project. I've given them some options, and I've already received some proposals from students. I've gotten 4 or 5 or 6 who've said, I would like to do a mission plan for a Ukrainian embassy. One of you said Brazil, one of you said Israel. I think this is a marvelous idea. And I want you to know that in our archive, in our Google Docs, Google Classroom, I've put today at the top of the list a sample that might help you in doing this project. It's purely fictional. It's not a real thing, but and maybe Secretary Kramer can help us with this if he wants to. Every year, every U.S. embassy in the world goes through a process. It's partly a team building process, and it's partly the working out of a strategy. This is not a quick thing. Someone drafts it, 5 or 10 people add their input or their suggestions. It goes back and forth from Washington to the embassy. And at the end of the process, we have something we used to call these MRRs, Mission Resource Requests. They're now called Integrated Country Strategies, ICS. Now, I'm not saying that a Ukrainian or a Kazakh or a Kenyan has to follow the same format that the US government does, but I've given you a sample. I cannot give you a verbatim sample because these documents are internal documents, but I've given you a fictional one for Nigeria, which kind of shows you the format. You can use this as a guideline if you want. You can ignore it. I just thought it would be interesting for you to see basically how the US government does this. And we do it for every embassy of the world every year. Now, Secretary Kramer, over to you. You have so many iterations in your career, we don't know where to start. I'm going to let you decide, and I'm going to pass the mic to you, Secretary Kramer.
Well, Dan, thanks, and please do call me David.
Okay.
It's great to be with you, and I think as you and I had been discussing in the lead up to this, try to make this as interactive with your students as possible. I can just briefly say that I had the honor and privilege of serving in the State Department for 8 years during President George W. Bush's administration, and at the end was the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. But before that, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. So that's my regional area of focus, and thematic is on democracy and human rights. And needless to say, those two issues go very closely together, not necessarily in a positive way when it comes to democracy, human rights with some of those countries.
Yes.
So I followed those issues after I left the State Department in January of 2009, and went initially to the German Marshall Fund, which is a think tank in Washington that promotes transatlantic relations and has offices in a number of countries in Europe. And then was asked to run Freedom House, which I did for 4 years. And Freedom House is the oldest human rights organization in the United States. And where your classmate may be familiar with it, it produces an annual report called Freedom in the World that,
Mhm.
as you indicated, Dan, ranks countries as free, partly free, and not free. And I think is the gold standard for assessments of how
Yes.
countries are doing when it comes to political rights and civil liberties. Those are the two main categories that Freedom House uses to assess how a country falls in those three
Mhm.
rankings: free, partly free, and not free. And unfortunately, for the past 17 years, Freedom House has found decline when it comes to political rights and civil liberties around the world. And I dare say when they issue their next report early next year, they're likely to find an 18th year of decline. This is by far the longest stretch of decline when it comes to political rights and civil liberties and freedom around the world. And it is a deeply worrying trend that Freedom House, in its report that came out, I think it was in February or March this year, had hoped that democracy was making a bit of a return, because last year's declines were the smallest. And by that, they meant that there were 35 countries that registered declines. 34 countries actually registered gains, but there was still a decline. So I was at Freedom House then, and then I left in 2014, the end of 2014, and went to the McCain Institute for International Leadership,
Uh-huh.
which is based in Washington, but part of Arizona State University, and was there for about 2.5 years until in 2017, for some family health reasons, moved to Miami, and taught at Florida International University, which is the fourth largest university in the United States. It's a minority majority university, which is to say it is not surprisingly, given that it's in Miami, it has a very large Hispanic student and faculty population there. And it was a wonderful experience. I do miss Miami, particularly in the winter. But then I was asked to join the George W. Bush Institute, and started as the managing director for global policy there in January of last year. But then when the executive director, Holly Kuzmich, decided to leave for another job that she wanted to pursue, they asked me to step in and replace her. So I run the institute part of the George W. Bush Presidential
Mhm.
Center.
Mhm.
Presidents from Hoover through Obama have presidential centers or foundations named for them or after them. And President Bush has one in Dallas. And by talking about the center includes the Bush Museum. It includes the library, and it includes the institute. And the institute is the part that I run. And in the institute, we do domestic programs, we do global programs, and we have a program that is focused on strengthening our democracy, about U.S. democracy. We are rooted in four principles that guided President and Mrs. Bush when they were in Washington, that continue to guide them in their presidential life. And those are freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion. And based on those four principles, we work on ensuring opportunity on the domestic side. We try to advance free societies on the global side, and then we focus on strengthening our democracy. We have an online journal called The Catalyst, and it's been a great experience. The Institute is about 45 people, so it's not a huge place, particularly by DC think tank standards. But it's a wonderful organization, and President and Mrs. Bush are still actively involved, though not every single day. We just had a board meeting. Mrs. Bush serves on the board. President Bush is involved, although he likes to remind everyone that he's now 77 years old, and he thinks he's too old to be president, which is a little comment on the current leaders
Yes,
in the two
yes.
parties,
Yeah.
but not so subtle, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, so it's been a great experience. So let me stop there, Dan, and happy to go in any direction you want.
Well, thank you. What a menu, folks. These are amazing. This is an amazing curriculum vitae. I believe that we're looking at somebody who says he's David Kramer. I think there are 5 or 6 of him in reality. He mentioned the
Just means I can't hold on to a job. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's right. He mentioned the McCain Institute. I'd like to just mention what a marvelous, marvelous program that is. I believe I've dabbled in, I'm kind of aware of some of the exchange programs in Washington over the years. This is the one that I think does the very best job at taking mid-level professionals from every part of the world, giving them a 1-year experience, and they come out of this really tremendously inspired, and they've somebody from Ukraine, for example, Katerina Smagli, who organized our very first meeting with Ambassador Markarova. She is a graduate of the McCain Institute.
She is indeed.
And so I
guess recommended her for the program, in fact, and
fantastic.
She's fantastic. I'm in touch with her on a fairly regular basis, and she's just
great.
Wonderful.
This is great. She is, I must say, extremely overworked, and because she does most of the work in that embassy. Anything that, Ambassador Markarova is just absolutely marvelous, but it's Katerina Smagli in the background who makes those opportunities possible. She's tremendously productive, and I think her experience with the McCain Institute really made her. Michael Polt, also I'm sure you know Michael Polt.
Yeah, very well.
Who will be speaking with us in the spring, by the way.
He's a great guy.
He has very good memories of her. I don't know if in what direction we want to go. I would rather the students and the faculty joining us give us an indication of which of these many things they'd like to pick up on. Let me begin by saying, well, let's can we explain?
Maybe if I can do this, because I absolutely want to be guided by what your group wants to discuss, but can I take a minute just to make the case for why it's so important to support Ukraine? And this has been an issue. Sorry.
Of course. And that's okay. Your area, David. Yeah.
Yeah, and forgive me because I'm in a hotel room here in DC and my connection is not very solid here. But just very quickly, I don't know if you can see it, but I've been wearing this lapel pin since February 24th of last year. It's a U.S.-Ukraine flag. And as I mentioned, my regional area of experience is on this part of the world. Since 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, I have been arguing for strong support for Ukraine, including military assistance, which Ukraine has needed. And since February 24th of last year, with the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, I and President Bush and the entire Bush Institute have joined many others in the United States in support of Ukraine. And I very much hope that the U.S. Congress will pass assistance and appropriations for Ukraine. It desperately needs more help. I think Ukraine has been a tremendous for people around the world. The bravery and heroism of Ukrainians, the leadership of President Zelensky. It is on the front line of freedom. And the entire world is watching how the United States and other countries in Europe support Ukraine. The Chinese Communist Party leadership is watching how we support Ukraine. Among Ukraine's strongest supporters and advocates are Taiwanese. They understand the stakes involved here. There are connections between Russia and Iran when it comes to Ukraine. Of course, there are connections between Russia and Iran when it comes to Hamas and the terrorist attack launched by Hamas on October 7th against Israel. We need to support Ukrainians. Their leaders are not asking for us to send our men and women to fight this fight for them, but they do desperately need our military assistance, our financial assistance as well. And so we at the Bush Institute have been in pushing for more assistance. This is incredibly important. And the last thing I'll say about this, we also support assistance for Ukraine. We also support for Israel, rather, sorry, and of course, Ukraine. We support assistance for Taiwan. Border security is an important issue as well. And I know there are some people who say, well, we can't do all of this. Actually, we're the leader of the free world. We're the greatest nation on earth. We have a responsibility to do these things. These are our friends, our allies. They need our support. We also have to take care of our own domestic challenges. And it is not a case where we can focus on domestic problems, push a pause button, ask the rest of the world to please wait while we get our own house in order. We have to get our own house in order while helping our friends and allies around the world. And so this is something I think we need to do. And frankly, Ukraine needs the assistance as much, if not more, than Israel does. Supporting Israel is important. It's an important political and symbolic signal. But Ukraine actually is threatening force from the Putin regime that has committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and I would argue even genocide against the Ukrainian people. Of course, Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and that is a reflection of how bad the Russians have been behaving and treating Ukrainians. So anyway, I'll stop there, Dan, but just I thought I'd throw that out, David, maybe to stimulate some discussion.
David, thank you for that wonderful statement. We really appreciate it. We feel this, but you've articulated it remarkably well. A few weeks ago, we had Robert Gates on this in this series, and I'm sure you saw his recent article naming congressional dysfunction as the greatest security threat to the United States. Any comments on that? The budget, I think everyone on this call has been following the agony of the budget process. The latest iteration, we don't know if this will pass in the Senate, but it removes aid for Israel and Ukraine. And we understand why. We understand why. Something has to be worked out. The new speaker, we don't know much about him, but he's trying to reconcile irreconcilable political views. Any comments about this agonizing budget process, which is so important in assuring aid for Ukraine?
Well, Secretary Gates wrote that piece, as you know, Dan, before Speaker McCarthy was removed.
I know. It was published the day before. It was published on September 29th.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the House was without a speaker for weeks and weeks. As the world is on fire, we looked rather dysfunctional, as his article suggested. We looked rather pathetic, I think. And I understand the need to get as we call in the United States, a continuing resolution. Once the fiscal year expires, you need a continuing resolution to keep funding government programs. And the only way to get that through was what is called a clean CR, a clean continuing resolution that didn't make any cuts, didn't add anything, didn't attach any policy changes. But that's actually what cost Kevin McCarthy his speakership because just a few Republicans in the House were firmly opposed to that. Michael Johnson, the new speaker, basically did what Kevin McCarthy did in September. And we'll see if that costs him support within his Republican caucus. This is not our finest hour, I think it's fair to say. And the Congress is now in recess until after Thanksgiving, which is next Thursday. But I certainly hope that when they return, the House and the Senate will take up assistance, and whether it's linked to Israel or border security, as long as it gets done, assistance for Ukraine, that is. I think all of these things that I indicated are necessities. Senator McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, has been a strong supporter of Ukraine aid. But even in the Senate, there has been some resistance, and even strong advocates for Ukraine like Lindsey Graham have been linking it to border security recently. We do need more funding for our border security, there's no question. But we also have to make sure that support for Ukraine doesn't fall by the wayside. And so, as I said, not our finest hour for the past couple of months, but I hope that Congress will focus on what needs to get done.
Thank you. We really share that same wish, and we're not proud of this, folks. We would rather, when discussing strategy and conflict and crisis, it's an embarrassment that we have to expose our government's tentativeness to the entire world, because what happens in the Congress affects the entire world, and certainly Ukraine. David, you mentioned the International Criminal Court. Tell me if I've got the sequence right. President Clinton initialed the Rome Statute, and President Bush then worked very hard to undo that. Can you explain? I'm sure you were involved in this. Can you explain the rationale of the Bush administration in deciding that the U.S. government would not be a member of the International Criminal Court?
Yeah, I wasn't involved in it, Dan, but I can explain it. And the concerns were that other countries would use this against U.S. personnel, in particular, those in our armed forces. And as a result of that, the feeling was that we should not be a party to the Rome Treaty, to the ICC. And to this day, we are not a party to the International Criminal Court. Nor is Russia, nor is Ukraine, by the way. But that has not stopped the ICC from, rightly, in my view, moving ahead with an indictment against Putin. And, by the way, Russia's ombudswoman for children's rights, rather ironically. The indictment is rather narrow, I think too narrow, frankly. It is about the abduction of Ukrainian children from Ukraine into Russia. I think there are many issues under which Putin can and should be indicted. The Biden administration has supported this indictment, even though we are not a party to the Rome Treaty. And I think these days there's less of a debate about whether we should or should not be part of the indictment, part of the treaty, rather. Sorry. But the main focus is the international community thinks that Putin is a war criminal, and I think there's lots of evidence to support that. But that's why initially the Bush administration felt we should not be party to it.
Thank you. That's as I remember it, and partly because the United States is unique in having military in so many parts of the world. You can debate whether that's a good or bad thing, but we have it. And at the time, I remember the argument that Muammar Gaddafi or somebody would dramatize something by basically kidnapping a U.S. soldier. These are emotional.
And our forces in Afghanistan and Iraq as well, absolutely.
And these things are debatable, but thank you for the clarification. Later, in terms of, and it may seem a paradox to this group, the United States government is not a member of the ICC, but it publicly supports some of the indictments. Omar Bashir, for example, of Sudan, the U.S. government supported openly the ICC's indictment in that case and some others. So this may seem paradoxical. I would say get used to it. The world is, sometimes it's not as logical as we'd like to have it. One more question, and then I want to urge our participants to come in. Here's my institutional question. You have been a human rights champion in your capacity as Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. You've also been in various non-governmental institutions, championing the same cause, and that would be Freedom House, German Marshall Fund. How do these things fit between a governmental institution and a non-governmental? What is the relative strength that you find, since you've had the experience of being on both sides? Is it functional? Are we overdoing it by having a government policy in addition to a very strong NGO community like Freedom House? Does these fit together, is my question.
I think they are very complementary. I think there certainly has been a proliferation of think tanks in Washington over the past decade or two. One can argue whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think some of them have too much of an agenda. Some of them are geared up solely to support one political party or another, or one possible incoming administration or another. I don't think that's terribly healthy. I think the role, so there's the think tank world, and then there's the non-governmental community. And so GMF, German Marshall Fund, is part of the think tank world. Freedom House is part of the non-governmental organization world. NGOs, I think, play a critical role in the United States and elsewhere around the world. It is part of being a vibrant civil society. Just like a free press is so important to a democracy to act as an additional check and balance on potential government abuse and corruption, the NGO community plays a similarly important role. And so I do think that there is extremely important complementarity between that and what the government does. One thing that's unique, I believe, about the United States is what we call the revolving door. And you can argue whether this is a good or a bad thing. I think actually there are some real merits to this. And by that, it means that people working in the think tank world or in the non-governmental organization world, even in the private sector or academia, can come into the government. You don't have to be a career diplomat, say in the State Department. You could be a political appointee. You could be an expert scheduled appointment, a Schedule B, as they work. I started as a Schedule B, which is an expert term appointment, and then I became a political appointee in the Bush administration. I was never a career diplomat, but some of the finest people I met are career diplomats. Most dedicated people you could find, incredibly smart, incredibly brave. And then once an administration ends, if there's a change, particularly if it goes from one party to another, the political appointees channel out and new people come in. And it brings fresh thinking, fresh blood into the system. I think that's generally healthy. But I also think for those in the think tank world, I started at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 30 years ago, and then went to Carnegie Endowment. It's easy for people in the think tank world to criticize government policy, but once you get experience trying to make government policy, try to engage in formulation of policy, I think you'd come away from it with a much greater appreciation for how difficult and challenging it is. It's easy to take pot shots from outside, but once you understand the challenges inside, I think you come away with it with a much greater appreciation.
Very, very true. And I would say on the other side, I was career, not political. And when we had political appointees, we found them refreshing, not in every case, I think everybody would understand, but in many cases, they brought in refreshing views from the outside that the groupthink within the State Department actually needs. They need the fresh air of political appointees when those appointees have the professional background. That's not always the case. Um, since we're on this topic, and since you've worked in every imaginable human rights organization, can you explain NED, IRI, NDI? Because this is another world. I think our listeners today would benefit from knowing the origin and the functions of these three organizations. I'm sure you're familiar with them.
I am indeed.
Yeah, yeah,
So the NED, of course, is the National Endowment for Democracy. IRI is the International Republican Institute, and in full disclosure, I'm a board member of IRI, and the NDI is the National Democratic Institute. There's also the Solidarity Center and CITE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, that's part of the NED family, as it's called. They stem from a speech President Reagan gave in Westminster, um, uh, promoting the advancement of democracy around the world. And it's 40 years ago that the NED was created. And Carl Gershman became the president. Carl was at the NED for many, many years, did an outstanding job. Although it is interesting, Carl was there so long, some people thought he had an autocratic grip on running the place, but Carl did a fantastic job. Damon Wilson is now the president, a close friend of mine. And they receive most of their funding from the US Congress. They are an independent entity, but they do get funding from Congress. And they support democracy around the world. It can be from training election observers to political party training, to training media, conducting surveys. They do absolutely invaluable work. And the NED and these other organizations have offices around the world. I think all of them have opened offices in Taipei within the past year, which is an interesting development, particularly in light of President Biden's meeting yesterday with President Xi.
yeah.
But they're in all places, I think, probably in many of the countries represented by your group here today as well. And I think they work with local individuals as well, and they go where they're wanted. There's this
Mhm.
misconception that we insert ourselves into places where we're not wanted. Now, in a number of cases, we may not be wanted by the local governments, but civil society organizations very much want the presence and support from the NED family for what they're trying to do. And in many cases, without that support, the local NGOs would not be able to survive. So in many cases, the NED and NDI, IRI, and others provide support that makes an enormous difference in their
Mhm.
ability to function and sustain themselves. And so they do incredibly important work. They also face a number of challenges and threats, and so the work is not without its hazards, but it's incredibly
Yeah.
important work, and it's something that will continue.
And I think we should note the collegiality, clearly within the domestic sphere in the United States, there are great tensions between the Democratic and the Republican parties. Overseas, you would never know that they differ on any matter. I remember when I worked in South Africa, IRI and NDI shared an office. They shared a fax machine. This is the way things should be, in my
Right,
opinion.
absolutely.
How would you compare these with the Stiftungen? Are they at all comparable with German Stiftungen? We're just folks. We're explaining this just to give the atmospherics of the many different options there are in the world. We're going to ask David later any advice he might have for successor generation, brilliant young people in countries that are not the United States. If he might have any thoughts, is any of this applicable? Um, but let's how
So
do you
go on. I'll just say quickly on the Stiftungs, these
yeah,
are the German foundations,
yes.
and they have considerable resources in many cases. They are not exclusively, but more narrowly focused on Europe. And they tend to be a little more identified with the political parties in
Mhm.
Germany.
Yes.
You don't have to be a Democrat to work at NDI, nor do you have to be a Republican to work at IRI. As you mentioned, Dan, IRI and NDI work very closely in many countries around the world. The Stiftungs, I think, are a little more stovepiped.
Yes.
But I'm familiar with the work they do, for example, in Georgia, where they've done some great work supporting NGOs and think tanks there, and in Ukraine as well. So Germany is an important country to look at in terms of support coming from their
And
foundation.
let me just slip in that one of our members who's not with us today is today in Tbilisi with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung that is giving some sessions in Georgia. I'm so glad they're doing that.
Yep.
And she's a member of this group, and that's the reason she's not with us today. I mean, there's such a vast array of things. I suppose a person who's not a U.S. citizen is probably not going to be employed by NED, IRI, NDI. They could be by the Marshall Fund, I
No,
suppose.
they are. I mean, all of those organizations have many local employees. And so, particularly where they have a physical presence, if you are interested, there are websites you can go on in your countries to see what positions might be available. They absolutely rely on people in country to provide expertise, to provide logistical support and other things. So from accounting and finance to programmatic training, there are opportunities that
Wow.
NDI, IRI, and other organizations provide for sure.
Marvelous, marvelous, as well as the Agency for International Development, which I know has an office in Kyiv and
Yeah.
does employ Ukrainians. And I'm sure that there are parallels for Kazakhstan and Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
I would highly recommend the some of the people on this call are nearing the completion of their studies and should absolutely consider these things as professional options. That's a marvelous contribution. Um,
Without doubt.
Now, folks, what let's see, I can take this in many directions. Since our speaker is an expert on Ukraine and Russia, let's ask him. And in fact, okay, here's a question that we all think of, but we never mention. If, God forbid, that Putin should have any degree of success in Ukraine, we are all thinking, but we have never discussed which country would be next. Would it be Moldova? Would it be Georgia? Would it be Kazakhstan? Now, we're not asking you to be a prophet, David, but what is your concern about, Putin could even be defeated in this conflict, and he or the Kremlin or his successors could still be aggressive. You are very familiar with the region. How do you see this going? Any hypothesis, let's say win, draw, or lose, we know that Russia will continue to be aggressive. Where will they take their aggression, do you suppose?
Well, let me say that the greatest thing we could do for Russia and the Russian people would be to help Ukraine defeat it in Ukraine. I realize that sounds a little paradoxical, but the
No,
best thing that could
it's
happen to Russia is Putin's defeat in Ukraine. Of course,
absolutely.
that would be the best thing that could happen to Ukrainians as well. But if if the Ukrainians had not stopped Putin, remember most of the predictions, both from the outside expert community and within our own intelligence community, were that Russia would take over Ukraine in a matter of days. That Kyiv would be occupied, Zelensky would be overthrown, and none of that happened thanks to the heroism of the Ukrainian people, the brave leadership of Zelensky. Remember the famous line when the Biden administration offered to evacuate him? He said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." And so I think I believe that if the United States and our European allies provide Ukraine with the support it needs, Ukraine can win. And let me tell you what I mean by win. It means driving every Russian soldier that is occupying and invading Ukrainian territory from that territory, including Crimea, because Crimea is part of Ukraine.
Mhm.
Crimea, of course, was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. And so I firmly reject this push for negotiations, because if there were a negotiation, it would consign right now roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory under Russian occupation and millions of Ukrainians living under Russian oppression. And Ukrainians, it doesn't matter whether I think that or not, Ukrainians reject the idea of negotiations with Putin. They want to win and prevail so that Russia does not do this to their country again. And I know you have a number of Ukrainians on the screen here, and I'd be eager to hear their views on this. Ukraine has suffered terribly in this war. Tremendous damage, tremendous loss of life and injuries. But they want to make sure this does not happen again. And Putin, as you indicated in your question, Dan, is an ongoing threat to Ukraine, would be a threat to other countries. My sense has been that Moldova would be the next target on his list more than Kazakhstan. Moldova would be easier to swallow, if you would.
Yeah.
I don't think he wants a clash with NATO, as long as NATO remains strong and firm. But if NATO looks weak, then you could see moves against the Baltic states. This is why it's so important to support Ukraine, to help Ukraine win. I have never liked the phrase of the administration to support Ukraine as long as it takes. I don't know what it refers to. I wish we would say instead, we will support Ukraine until Ukraine wins, as long as the Ukrainian people want to seek victory. It's up to the Ukrainians to decide whether or if they ever want to sit down with the Russians. They are talking with them. We know that happens about prisoner exchanges and other things. But name me an agreement that Putin has abided by over the years, and then maybe there's something to work with. There aren't any. And Russia, of course, just formally withdrew from the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty. This was an issue going back to the Bush administration days I was involved in. Putin doesn't live up to his word at all. He is an existential threat to Ukraine and to other countries in the region. Last thing I'll just say is you hear Putin occasionally, but particularly Dmitry Medvedev, the former president seat warmer for Putin, talk about use of nuclear weapons. I don't buy that. I think that is designed to try to get the United States and others to back off of our support for Ukraine. You always have to take it seriously when a nuclear power threatens the use of nuclear weapons. But the United States has also made clear to the Kremlin that if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, the United States would respond militarily, not with a nuclear weapon, but the United States would respond militarily. Putin and his generals do not want a direct clash with the United States. So supporting Ukraine is so important to make sure that Putin, to borrow an old phrase, to make sure that his appetite does not grow with the eating. And so pushing Russia out of Ukraine is incredibly important.
Again, we've struggled with these matters. I've never heard it more succinctly expressed than how you've just put it. I was astonished last week when the European Union invited Ukraine to apply for membership. Were you?
No, because last year they extended candidacy status to Ukraine and Moldova. And so this was the next logical step in the process. I hope the EU recognizes that Ukraine is under attack every single day, has done an extremely important job in trying to fulfill the criteria for moving ahead with membership. I also support having Ukraine join NATO, by the way. There is no other NATO country that has the experience fighting the Russians than Ukraine has, sadly.
Yes.
And Ukraine would clearly be a contributing nation, country to NATO, and would not just be a consumer of what NATO provides. It's a tricky issue, of course, and this is a big problem for Moscow. But Moscow created this problem. And one last thing, NATO enlargement, as some people argue, like John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt and others, that NATO enlargement is the cause of all this. It is utter nonsense.
Yes.
When Russia invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014, Ukraine had legislation in place declaring that it was not seeking NATO membership. In 2008, I'm not going to go into all the details, but 2008, Ukraine sought what's called a membership action plan. This was under President Yushchenko, and it was a stepping stone they had hoped toward NATO membership. In 2010, after Yanukovych was elected president, he signed legislation in August 2010, making Ukraine essentially a non-aligned state. It was no longer seeking NATO membership. In 2014 or 2013, rather, Ukraine was on the verge of signing some agreements, not with NATO, but with the European Union. And Putin pressured Yanukovych not to sign those agreements. No one was talking about Ukraine and NATO in the same sentence in 2013 or 2014. But after Russia invaded Ukraine the first time, support for NATO membership significantly increased. And then when President Zelensky was elected in 2019, he made it a key part of his foreign policy to seek NATO membership. The problem was he wasn't getting any traction, including from President Biden. President Biden didn't seem supportive of Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO. But there's going to be a NATO summit in Washington next summer. I hope that NATO will extend an invitation to Ukraine. That doesn't mean Ukraine joins the next day, but it means we begin the accession process, which I think Ukraine has very much deserved.
I mean, for what it's worth, I totally agree. I guess the argument against it is within the NATO bureaucracy, they would be reluctant to bring in a country that's currently involved in a conflict. This would have huge, this would put huge responsibilities on NATO that it would have trouble fulfilling. It's a wonderful idea. It may not be realistic. David mentions John Mearsheimer, one of my least favorite people, but it's somebody we need to be aware of. He's been in his funny way, he's been very belligerent, a belligerent advocate of non-belligerency. He's very condescending to anybody who disagrees with him. And thank you, David, for putting this on the record. As the president of Finland said, when Finland joined NATO, and Putin said, "How could you do this? You were Finland." And the president said, "Well, you did this, President Putin." It was a very effective exchange. The last item I want to bring up, and again, I encourage, David has asked Ukrainians for their reactions to his view of Russian aggression and what this term, as long as it takes, that we can talk about that. This week, our assignment that we worked on, I think I sent you an email on this, was this thing we used to call the liberal rules-based international order, which seems to be unraveling extremely quickly. Putin denounced it 10 days ago. Xi has denounced it. The global South seems uninterested in it. What in the world is happening? We know why. They believe that this is Washington-centric and it's an expression of Western dominance and arrogance. But for God's sake, does somebody want a world without rules? What are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
No, that's I was just killing my phone, which was yeah.
It's under duress like we haven't seen in maybe since the end of World War II. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused the greatest security crisis on the European continent since the end of World War II. We've seen the Hamas attack against Israel, which was the worst attack against Jews since the Holocaust. We see China flexing its muscles as well, Iran playing a very harmful role in a lot of these places. Iran has provided much needed support to Russia through Shahed drones to use against Ukraine. Iran obviously also supports Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. It's a state sponsor of terrorism. I know there have been people who have argued Russia should be designated a state sponsor of terrorism as well. North Korea plays a role in this. Train loads of North Korean ammunition and other weapons being sent to Russia. That's also, by the way, an indication of how desperate Russia is, that it has to rely on Iran and North Korea. It's otherwise rather isolated. President Putin was just in Beijing, as you hinted at, Dan, and China, at least as far as we know, has not provided military assistance to Russia, and yet there are countries who should understand that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created a clear black and white situation. There is no murkiness here. Russia is the clear aggressor, violating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine is the victim in this case, and yet too many countries in the global south have been sitting on the fence for various reasons, including India, which actually has increased its imports of Russian energy since the full-scale invasion last February. You know about the BRICS gathering as well. And yet what's interesting is when BRICS met in South Africa, President Putin wasn't able to travel to South Africa because South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Treaty, a member of the ICC, and South Africa would have been obligated to arrest Putin and surrender him to The Hague to face justice there. One other quick additional point on that, Armenia, which has been heavily reliant on Russia for its security, has become extremely unhappy and disillusioned with Russian support for failing to come to Armenia's aid when Azerbaijan took over Nagorno-Karabakh. In response to that, Armenia's parliament approved joining the Rome Treaty and the ICC, and Armenia now is a member of the ICC. And if Putin were to visit Yerevan, Armenia has indicated it would have to arrest him. Talk about ironies there, but it's an indication of how Putin has alienated countries along Russia's borders, has lost support there. About the only country that is supportive has been Belarus, but not the people of Belarus, but the dictatorial regime and Alexander Lukashenko. President Tokayev has kept his distance from Putin. We saw that not long ago when the two leaders met. So I think the invasion of Ukraine has been an enormous setback for what Putin hoped to accomplish. As you indicated, Finland Finland has joined. Sweden is on the verge of joining NATO. That never would have happened had Putin not invaded in a full-scale way Ukraine last year. It's been a tremendous strategic blunder on Putin's part. But the tragic thing of it is that Ukrainians are paying a terrible price in the process.
And here's another irony. When Omar Bashir went to South Africa some years ago, indicted by the ICC, the South African justice system arrested him.
Yes.
The president of South Africa, very embarrassed by all of this, did something to reverse it, and Bashir was released. So Bashir went to South Africa, but Putin is afraid to do so. That's another fascinating irony. This is tremendously. This opens us, David, to all sorts of things. In concluding, let's you have commented on this, but let's think about the careers of the people on this call. We have a significant number of Ukrainians and Kazakhs and also Kenyans and some others. Some of them are going to graduate from tertiary institutions within the next couple of years. What is your advice to them in terms of having meaningful careers which will help build their countries?
I guess what I would say is, and this frankly applies in the United States, all of our countries need good people to serve in various roles, whether it's joining the government, joining the military, joining non-governmental organizations, pursuing academic careers and becoming experts on certain issues. These are tough times. They're especially tough times for Ukrainians. And I know a lot of Ukrainians have left the country. My hope is that over time, a lot of those Ukrainians who left will return and contribute. Ukraine, I think, has been an inspiration to all of us. And so I hope that we recognize, whether it's in Kazakhstan, Kenya, or Ukraine, or here in the United States, we cannot fall into fatigue you hear about this Ukraine fatigue, you know, countries saying, how much longer can we support Ukraine? I really get annoyed with those arguments because again, Ukrainians are the ones who are doing the fighting and tragically the dying for their country. We're the ones who are, and I don't mean to minimize this, we're signing checks basically in order to fund largely defense contractors here in the United States to produce the weapons that Ukrainians need. We aren't giving Ukraine blank checks. And so we need to remember that we all have some sacrifices to make. But we all can contribute in our unique ways. We at the Bush Institute in early September, excuse me, we convened the other presidential centers in the country, going from Hoover to Obama. And we put out an unprecedented statement that our centers had never agreed on a statement before. We never even tried, but we felt the time was important to reaffirm our democratic principles and remind ourselves of the shortcomings that we've had in our history and the progress that we made, but the job that still remains. There's the phrase striving toward a more perfect union. And the United States is constantly striving toward being a more perfect union. And in order to do so, we need committed individuals who want to make a positive difference in their own lives and in their country's lives. So I think a dedication to public service in one form or another, there are many ways of doing it, is what I would recommend to your group.
Wonderful words, David. You've demonstrated this in your 500 positions that you've occupied in the private sector, in the public sector. I think you are a manifestation of the principle that one can do both and either. Let me make a crazy idea, and you can just think about this if you want to. We have remarkable individuals on this call. Some of them would be excellent interns remotely to the Bush Center. Maybe you could think about that, and or maybe we could exchange some emails where you might have some suggestions on
Sure.
how people domiciled in Central and Eastern Europe might benefit from internship opportunities, even if they can't be a fellow at the McCain Institute. There may be alternatives. Let me read to you an email that just came in from Ambassador Tom Pickering, who was our speaker last time. He says, I'm reading this: I remain committed to the values you describe. I thank you for the chance to talk about them once again with your wonderful students. So the people on this call have been noticed by David Kramer, by Thomas Pickering, and you are remarkable. On Monday, you will get to talk to Marcy Shore, a historian at Yale, who, by the way, is the wife of Tim Snyder. Marcy Shore teaches intellectual history and traces the German philosopher Kant as a subliminal cause and motivation to the Maidan uprising. David described to us that strange moment when Ukraine was about to sign an agreement with the European Union. He went to, I think it was Vilnius, to do that, but he received a phone call, I think from Moscow, and he came back. He refused to sign. Marcy Shore was very emotionally involved in that. She was close friends with many of the people involved, and she will be our speaker on Monday. On Thursday, we will repeat the exercise we did. We ran out of time when we did our simulation, so I want everybody who participated in that to review their notes, to review their after action reports, and let's go at it again. This is a fictional migration crisis, David, created by the National Museum of American Diplomacy. And we did what we could. It's a little bit difficult to do these things remotely. So we've done it. We've done some after action reports. We're going to continue with the same plenary sessions and see how we can further the arguments of each delegation. David Kramer, you're a busy guy. We're so grateful. to get to know you a bit, and we will be bothering you in the future. That's a guarantee. Thank you so
Not
much,
a problem.
and stay at it. We need many David Kramers in the world, and you are officially a Mensch because you received that award. That's a little in joke between the two of us.
Indeed.
But he is officially and unofficially a Mensch.
Dan, thank you very much. I really am grateful for the opportunity to join you and your class here, and happy to stay in touch. And whether with the Bush Institute, or other organizations here in DC, where I am today, happy to be a help and resource. And Slava Ukraini.
Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
Very
Goodbye
fun.
for today.
Mhm.